all of the kind of moving pieces with assessments, all of the accountability waivers that are popping up, and maybe perhaps of interest, I co-facilitate with one of my colleagues at the center the technical issues in large-scale assessment state collaborative for the Council for Chief State School Officers. So this has been top of mind for us quite recently. Thanks, Alan.
Thanks, Juan. And Steve?
Yeah, I'm Steve Dunbar. I'm co-director of Iowa Testing Programs along with Kathy Welch, my colleague here. We are the co-directors of the Iowa Statewide Assessment of Student Progress, the state of Iowa's new ESSA assessment. And we also are faculty members in the Educational Measurement and Stats program at the University of Iowa, training master's and PhD students to enter the field.
Great, thanks, Steve. LaTisha?
Hi, everybody. My name is LaTisha Grimes. I'm the Executive Director over Assessments and Logistics for the Cleveland Metropolitan School District that's in Ohio. Just to give you just a quick background of the district, there are 38,000 students in our district. We are an urban district, predominantly African-American, roughly 64%, 17% Hispanic, and 15% white, and 4% other. We have an even kill split on gender for female and male 50%. Oh, okay, 50% split. And then our K-8 building, just so you can get a distribution, we have 67 K-8 buildings and 36 high schools, and we're the second largest in the state of Ohio. Thank you.
Thank you, LaTisha. Gage?
Good morning, folks. I'm Gage Kingsbury, and that was my obnoxious phone going off just recently. I turned it off. Sorry about that. I'm retired as the VP of Research for NWEA, and currently I serve on several technical advisory committees, State of Hawaii, Smarter Balanced, NWEA, and a couple others. And I haven't directed a testing program in a long, long time. So I look forward to learning a lot.
Thanks. And Val?
Yeah, hi, I'm Val Schmid-Sadwin. I'd like to thank the NAAD for inviting me to speak on this panel, and I feel I don't have the credentials of my other esteemed panelists, but I do have 20 years of experience in state testing with the Cherry Hill School District, which is a school district of about 11,000 students right across the river from Philadelphia. So my hope for today, I have been thinking a lot about state testing this year. My hope for today is to relay my district's and state's kind of stories about the state testing situation and my perspective on the different windows that are being offered.
Thanks very much. That's your introduction to our esteemed panelists. And I keep skipping past that. So we have two questions today. They're really related, and they have to do with the implications of the pandemic for what decisions are made at various levels for assessment in the coming year. So certainly most states were not able to test in the spring of 2020, and now we're trying to figure out what to do this spring and how to handle that testing. So given this current context, the question really is, the first part of the question is, what would you suggest would be the best option? And the follow-on, just to give you a little spoiler there for number two, is how would you argue your case? So we may get some arguments in here as you present. I do want to note that those of you at the district level you yourselves and those you work with are the ones doing most of the testing and doing the most test and score interpretation, and we cannot forget that. The state level gets a lot of attention, but you guys are really the ones doing all that work. So that's critically important, and I want to be an ally and supporter in elevating your voices and whatever we can to make sure we understand what you see as your options and why, and what are the pros and cons of each, because people often just slide right over all the kind of logistical issues and all the things that you have to do to implement the policies that you get handed. So this would be a great place to help make a case for that more broadly. And even to think about in this discussion, how can we do that, better elevate the voices of the local leaders in the assessment conversation and help to impact policy perhaps down the road. So my prerogative here, I guess, as a facilitator, I get to pick and choose who goes first on this. And since we have an array of panelists who represent different perspectives and different positions in the testing arena, I'd like to start with our local folks here. So, and you each are in a different place, so you're in different states. So, LaTisha, would you mind starting here with just like what do you think would be your best choice? What would you hope for? You can think about what's happening and say that, but what would you hope for would it be happening if you're in terms of administration of what we typically consider to that statewide 2021 and any other assessments you're thinking about?
Mm-hmm. So although the administration gave grace on either pushing the assessments back, keeping them in the spring, or offering extensions, our state actually decided to remain with the spring window. They did provide the extension, and I'm in agreement with having the spring window, and it's for a couple of reasons. Although we didn't do testing last year, we do have historical data. So we administer in our district the MAP assessments through NWEA. So that's fall and in the winter. But we rely heavily on our assessments from the state for standard setting. So it's important for us to keep being able to compare apples to apples. And I'm sorry, I got a little bit of work going on in the background. But another thing is our state did permit to extend our window. We in Cleveland just started in March. Our students just started back hybrid. And we don't have the option to do online. We have to do face-to-face testing. So I would argue that to keep the spring window.
Okay, all right. Val, what are your thoughts here?
It helps if I unmute. Although I've said my best things, I think, muted, but no one will ever know. But in order to understand my position, you really need to understand where we are on both Cherry Hill and New Jersey. Our current learning model, we're in Cherry Hill, we're about half remote, and then we are half hybrid, and the hybrid is either 2 or 4 in-person days for 4 hours per day. In New Jersey, about a quarter of the districts are still remote, about 2/3 are hybrid, and only a little more than 10% are full in-person. Then you have to get to the politics around state testing in our state. We were part of the former PARC consortium. There was active movements in the early years for parents to refuse to let their children take the PARC. Part of the current governor's platform was to get rid of PARC testing. So they changed the name, they shortened the tests, and finally we were generally getting the 95% required participation. The current length of our test for ELA, math, and science goes 9 to 10 hours over 9 testing units. So let's just say New Jersey has we're reluctant state test takers before COVID. So let's talk about spring testing. Why are we testing? What do we want from the data? And from what I've read, what we want from the data is we need to measure learning loss. We need to do it in the spring in order to know where to focus our resources and focus on where it's needed. So what would spring testing look like? In our state, both in-person and remote testing are allowed. In-person testing schedules would be stretched out because we only have 4 hours a day in person. We would expect low participation. Parents are willing to send their children in for the benefit of in-person learning during this time, but they're not going to send their kids in for state testing. In Cherry Hill, if we administered this test, personally, I believe if 50% of our testing population showed up to test, I would be amazed. What is equity in testing? Equity in testing would be testing the vast majority of students in consistent, comparable testing conditions. With the current learning models in New Jersey, this just would not happen. With remote and in-person learning testing allowed, this would not happen. What would we get from the data? With remote testing, certainly we would not get validity. Who's helping the test taker? It could be a well-meaning parent, babysitter, older sibling, because everyone really is going through so much. Does the test taker have a quiet, uninterrupted testing environment like the in-person test taker? What prevents the test taker from using outside resources, other devices, books, notes, whatever? Participation would be low. Could we generalize the results of this test to our total population? No. This is not a random sample. No one could think that the test takers and the non-participants are representative of each other or our total population. Could the results of this test reliably be compared to other test results? No. My opinion of spring testing in New Jersey, it would be a colossal waste of valuable resources when we need every resource devoted to social, emotional, and academic learning. Now, for states with higher percentages of in-person learning, no remote testing, and better buy-in for the state test, it may work for you. I just don't think it would work for our district or the state of New Jersey. Summer testing. If you don't have a summer school for all students, I don't see how anyone could convince students to come in for state testing during the summer. Fall testing. My opinion is it could work, but you just can't plug the spring assessments into the fall time slot and call it a day. Hopefully for more in-person learning for a full day, not just 4 hours. Hopefully fall will be more normal than it is today. We'd hopefully have higher participation for in-person test taking, therefore increased equity. Test everyone in consistent, comparable testing conditions. We need to change the purpose of our data. Forget using a state assessment to calculating learning loss for now. You can't reliably compare the fall assessments to anything that we have. You use multiple measures to determine during the summer, based on the 2020 data that we're collecting, 2020-21 data that we're collecting right now, to determine what supports and that are needed. But use a fall test as an indicator of where students are right now at the beginning of the school year. And you need to change the test. You need to design the test to inform upcoming instruction. The test would have to be shorter than the 9 hours that we have in New Jersey. The test would need to be instantly scored so that the results could be used. And you could use the test to confirm the placements in the programs and supports that you were working on during the summer, or if they conflict, then you would need to dig deeper to find the truth. So for me, I don't see how spring or summer would work in the state of New Jersey or in our district, and I'm hoping for the possibility of fall assessments.
Alan, can I chime in real quick?
Of course.
So I completely get Val's point with states that actually have to do online and face-to-face, because I wasn't aware that states are actually doing that. So, but with Ohio, we don't have an option. So it's face-to-face and it's spring. But to also chime in on what Val said, when it's dealing with summer, I agree. It would not be equitable on all fronts, because not all students come in to test. Now we do in Ohio administer summer testing, but this is for retakes because we have everything tied to graduation. It wouldn't work for fall for us as well because we have additional state assessments linked to students for promotional reasons as far as our third grade reading guarantee. So if you don't pass this test in a certain, with a certain scaled score, students won't get promoted to the fourth grade, and that is a state assessment. So with those two things colliding, that would be a problem. Also, we have a lot of formative assessments district-wide that we do in the fall. So for our grades 3 through 10, which will couple and provide information for us that the state assessment wouldn't necessarily, because we focus on growth in the fall. So I just wanted to chime in and add on to what Val was saying.
Sorry, my screen is just slow today. Couldn't unmute. I think that was fantastic to hear two very different sets of circumstances and contexts, so we can see how challenging this is playing out across the country. Because you've represented, the two of you, a wide range of circumstances here in terms of how students are participating in the instruction and learning this year and what your expectations are. And also there's a lot to be teased out in there, and let's see what other panelists had to say about the uses of those test scores. But the notion of simply chopping up your test or moving it around doesn't sound like it makes sense to either one of you. So that's important to recognize. I'm going to turn to our panelists, and Juan, I'm going to put you on the spot first, and just so you know, I'm then go to Steve and then to Gage. So Juan first.
Great. And thanks, Ellen. Yeah, and actually really interesting perspectives from both of the district's folks. I think it's kind of, I think the order makes a lot of sense, because our goal is really to help make the argument sound and support the desired approach by whether it's a state or a group of districts given the context. And I think that being said, I think the key is really what is the inference you're trying to make and what claims you want to support, because that really helps you define the challenge that you're willing to take on. I think when thinking about spring, summer, and fall, with spring, obviously the issue is going to be around COVID, of course. It is, I think, one of the main challenges that it's really could be perceived as tone deaf to focus on assessment when there's so many other things that need to be, probably what fires need to be put out immediately. And there are likely very similar claims, but not necessarily comparable across districts and schools, that you could make to assess the impact on learning using things like interims or formative assessments that are probably broader in scope and maybe more appropriate in this time. But there are, especially on the heels of Secretary Cardona's letter and the statement that came out either yesterday or the day before about kind of the ed holding the line on summative assessments, this is probably an opportunity to think of large-scale summative assessment as a census test first and a performance assessment second. There is a great write-up that was done by Andrew Ho from the Harvard Graduate School of Education that kind of outlined a set of 3 considerations for how you should look at your data, because you might actually end up using large-scale assessment to detect that there's a completely different change to your population of students that you might not have been fully aware of going into this spring timing. The other major challenge, right, is if the kids aren't in school, you really can't administer many of these large-scale summative assessments online because they weren't designed that way from the get-go. So if we can't assure that there are standardized conditions for administration, we're really losing sight of the intended purpose of trying to minimize noise in administration to actually detect the signal performance for systems in general. And in that sense, I mean schools, districts, and the state. You know, large-scale summatives are intended to be designed as accessible as possible for all students. And they undergo a series of bias and sensitivity reviews. I think Val's point on equity is important because there is a very explicit focus on making sure that these tests can be accessed by as many kids as possible. It's not to say that those processes can't be improved by any means, but the transparency behind them makes it easier to identify where those challenges might exist. So that's not potentially as accessible when you're talking about assessments that are less scrutinized because they don't have the requirements associated with peer review. I've heard a couple states talk about the value of summer administrations, and I think it could be powerful to use if you're not moving too far into the summer. I think the timing of when you might need to get those data back is critically important because they have to be timely enough to inform system level decisions. While you could potentially increase the level of participation and spreading out by spreading out that frequency of administration, it would be really difficult to obtain buy-in. And one way to mitigate this, I think, is to maybe creatively think about the use of some of the CARES funding. What if there was a way to leverage some of the recent funding to provide things like focused tutoring to address the potential impact of instructional interruptions, which could help justify some additional instructional time in the summer, and then try to get some assessment done at the same time. But again, you probably are going to get much more close to the ground information by using non-summative assessments to really identify the information that could be used from an instructional standpoint. The fall approach makes me a little nervous because it feels more like a compliance exercise. If you consider the response at the beginning of this school year, a lot of the curriculum and instructional groups were talking and being adamant about not trying to go down what they're referring to as like a remediation black hole, and instead on focusing on where you can scaffold towards grade level standards. I think a major risk that I see here is perseverating on data that informs progress against prior year standards as a potential starting point, especially because it's not fine-grained enough to be instructionally sensitive to inform the next instructional decision. System level decisions, sure. I think PD selection and broad challenges for groups of students, I think it's more defensible. But if you factor in the timing of when you would obtain the data and how fast, I think, I don't remember if it was LaTisha or Val that said kind of the speed, like to have really fast turnaround of scoring, the data are already going to be obsolete for the next school year. And I want to place a much stronger emphasis on curriculum embedded assessments and how probably teacher observations and evidence could be corroborated using interim assessments that I think a couple of the other panelists could speak to very clearly. Thanks.
Great. Okay, Steve.
Well, my thoughts go out to Gage as being the last one to comment, because when you go in order like this, you're always in danger of not having anything left to say. And I just compliment the previous presenters on their attentiveness to their local situations. And I can't say how different those two perspectives are and how different they are from what we're experiencing here in the state of Iowa, where we had a state law passed in the middle of February, took effect immediately, that required every district to provide 100% in-person learning experiences for schools. It very quickly ended hybrid programs. It turned remote learning programs into a small percentage. And as we have begun our state testing window this past week, we're expecting at least what appears on the surface to be a regular administration of our statewide assessment. Regular administration doesn't mean results are interpretable through the same lens as the lens that we might ordinarily associate with a statewide summative assessment. In listening to the other panelists, I think we're looking at a time where I like to think of it as an opportunity. I've been in large-scale testing for longer than I want to admit in front of a group like this. Some of you know how long that is. And I've never been a fan of to be honest, of the use of large-scale assessments purely for accountability purposes. I believe any kind of assessment, if it's going to be useful at the local level, has got to provide reports that support some kind of instructional decision-making, some kind of evidence that can be used to take students forward. We talk about using our tests now to measure learning loss, and I think our two district people have indicated how difficult it is to simply attach a learning loss interpretation to the results that we're going to be seeing, whether we test in the spring, the summer, or the fall looking forward. I think we have to get beyond the idea that results for this period of time are going to be interpretable in a single way as measures of learning loss, as measures of accountability to determine where districts are. I think it's going to be incumbent on statewide assessment providers to push the kind of information out that might be a little more detailed than is typically supported by the vendors who are offering these tests, to get information into a framework that allows teachers in the classroom to make use of these assessment results as well as those of other types of assessments that are being used at the local level. It's incredibly important to make an assessment regardless of time here on simply the feasibility of conducting a large-scale assessment. Val, I think your comments went directly to the point of the extent to which a large-scale assessment